April 4th, 1945. Ohrdruf, Germany, 18 miles southwest of Erfurt. The gates of the labor camp had been open for 6 hours when Patton's advance elements arrived. Not liberated, abandoned. The SS guards had left on foot 3 days earlier, after receiving word that Third Army's armor was 40 miles out and closing at 30 miles per hour. They had left in such haste that the administrative records were still on the commandant's desk. The daily logs, the prisoner count sheets, the cause of death records filled out in the neat, unhurried handwriting of a man who had done this paperwork many times before. Died of hunger. Entry after entry, column after column. Dates running from January through late March 1945. Died of hunger. Died of hunger. Died of hunger. The advance patrol that found the camp reported to 3rd Army headquarters at 0615 hours. The report described the physical condition of the camp. It described the prisoners found alive, 251 of them, out of a population that the administrative records listed as 11,700 as recently as November 1944. It described something else. The cause of death records said hunger. The bodies said something different entirely. To understand what Patton found at Ohrdruf, you must first understand what the SS administrative system was designed to conceal and what it was designed to reveal. Ohrdruf, designated Konzentrationslager Ohrdruf, a subcamp of the Buchenwald complex, had been established in November 1944 to provide forced labor for the construction of underground communications infrastructure for Wehrmacht headquarters. At its peak in January 1945, the camp held approximately 11,700 prisoners, predominantly Jewish men from Hungary, Poland, and the former Soviet occupation territories, transferred west as the Eastern Front collapsed. The SS record-keeping system that administered Ohrdruf was, in its design, meticulous. Every prisoner was numbered. Every death was logged. Every cause of death was recorded. This was not humanitarian record-keeping. It was administrative cover. The system produced documentation that, if reviewed at the level of a column entry on a page, told one story. The bodies told another. General Major Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin, a Wehrmacht commander whose forces had operated in the Thuringia region until the American advance in late March 1945, stated in his post-war memoir that the SS camp system in his operational area had operated entirely outside Wehrmacht knowledge or authority. He said this in 1948. The claim was professionally convenient. Whether it was accurate was a question the American forces arriving at Ohrdruf on April 4, 1945, were not focused on answering. They were focused on what the bodies were telling them. And the bodies were contradicting every page of that administrative record. Among the SS personnel captured in the Ohrdruf vicinity in the 48 hours following Third Army's arrival was an Unterscharfer, a junior sergeant named Rudolph Stein. He was 26 years old. He had been captured by a reconnaissance element of the 4th Armored Division on April 5th, hiding in civilian clothes in a farmhouse 3 kilometers from the camp perimeter. His identity was established through a tattoo, the SS blood type mark, inked under the left arm of every Waffen-SS member, which had become so reliable an identification method that American soldiers were systematically checking left arms on male German civilians across the entire theater by April 1945. Stein was transported to the Ohrdruf site and held for interrogation by 3rd Army's Counterintelligence Corps detachment. In his initial statement, given through an interpreter on the afternoon of April 5th, he confirmed his assignment to the camp's guard detail from December 1944 through March 27, 1945. He described his duties as maintaining perimeter security. He described the prisoner deaths he had witnessed as resulting from disease and insufficient food supply. Died of hunger. The same formulation as the administrative records. The same clean, bureaucratic erasure of what had actually occurred. The sick interrogating officer filed a preliminary report at 1800 hours on April 5th. The report noted that the physical evidence in the camp, specifically the condition of 70 bodies found in a shallow pit near the camp's eastern perimeter, was inconsistent with the stated cause of death on the administrative records and inconsistent with the prisoner's account. Patton read that report at 0700 hours on April 6th. He was at Ohrdruf by 0900. Patton had been to Ohrdruf once already, on April 4th, within hours of the camp's discovery. He had walked the perimeter. He had seen the barracks. He had seen the living prisoners, 251 men, whose physical condition the 3rd Army Medical Officer's report, filed April 4th, described as consistent with severe prolonged malnutrition and physical abuse, with multiple individuals exhibiting injury patterns inconsistent with purely nutritional deprivation. Multiple individuals exhibiting injury patterns inconsistent with purely nutritional deprivation. Medical language for bullet wounds. For blunt force trauma. For evidence that men had not died of hunger but had been killed, and the paperwork had then been filled out to say they had died of hunger. When Patton returned on April 6th, he had a specific purpose. He had requested that Stein be present at the site during his visit. The sick officer managing the prisoner had advised against it on security grounds. Patton overruled him. Stein was brought to the shallow pit near the eastern perimeter. 70 bodies had been partially exhumed by Army medical personnel over the previous 36 hours as part of the evidentiary documentation process. The Army's medical officer, Major Paul Whitefield, assigned to 3rd Army's medical section, had completed an initial forensic assessment of 41 of those bodies by the morning of April 6th. His findings were specific. Of the 41 bodies examined, 37 showed evidence of gunshot wounds, specifically wounds consistent with execution at close range, with entry wounds to the posterior cranium in 22 of the 37 cases. The remaining 15 showed evidence of blunt force injury to the skull. 1 showed evidence of both. None of the 41 bodies examined showed skeletal or tissue changes consistent with death by starvation as the primary cause of death. Not one. Patton stood at the edge of that pit with Rudolph Stein beside him. He had Major Whitefield's report in his hand. He read from it, not the summary, the specific findings. Entry wounds. Posterior cranium. 37 of 41. He read the numbers to Stein through the interpreter, paragraph by paragraph, with the patience of a man who intends to be clearly understood. Then he stopped reading and turned to face Stein directly. He said, and this exchange was recorded by the psych officer present, Sergeant Harold Myers, in his field notes dated April 6, 1945, which were later incorporated into the Ohrdruf war crimes documentation file, that the records Stein had maintained said these men died of hunger. Patton pointed at the bodies in the pit and asked Stein to explain the bullet holes. Stein said nothing for a long moment. Then, he said that the shootings had occurred during an escape attempt, that guards had fired in accordance with camp regulations when prisoners attempted to cross the perimeter wire. 70 men. Attempting to escape. Simultaneously. Shot from behind, at close range, in the back of the skull. Patton looked at him for a period of time that Myers's notes describe as approximately 15 seconds. Then he turned away and did not speak to Stein again. What came next was not a speech. It was a series of orders, given in the next 20 minutes, that defined how 3rd Army would document, process, and preserve the evidence of what had occurred at every camp it found in the remaining weeks of the war. Every body was to be fully examined and documented before burial. Every administrative record was to be seized and preserved intact. Every SS personnel member identified was to be held separately from Wehrmacht prisoners and subjected to individual documentation procedures. Local German civilian populations within a 10-kilometer radius of any discovered camp were to be required to tour the site under military escort. The last order was the one that the German civilian population of Ohrdruf and the surrounding villages remembered longest. They were not asked if they had known. They were not given the choice of whether to see. They were marched through the camp on April 7, 1945, and they looked at what the administrative records had described as deaths by hunger. And they saw the bullet holes. April 12, 1945. Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton toured Ohrdruf together. Eisenhower had specifically requested the visit after receiving Third Army's preliminary documentation reports. He understood, with a clarity that his subsequent communications made explicit, that the physical evidence at these camps needed to be witnessed at the highest command level, not for strategic reasons, but for historical ones. He wrote to General Marshall on April 15, 1945, describing what he had seen at Ohrdruf in specific terms, and requesting that congressional delegations and journalists be brought to the site immediately, while the evidence remained intact, because he anticipated that the events documented there would be denied in the future. Emphasis on denied. He was correct. He knew it on April 12th. He prepared against it on April 15th. Patton's response to the tour was documented by his aide and by multiple officers present. He was physically ill at one point during the walk. He did not attempt to conceal it. The man who had commanded armies across 2 continents, who had absorbed casualty reports in the thousands without visible emotional response, stood in that camp and could not maintain professional composure. He did not regard this as weakness. His diary entry for April 12th reads, "I have seen many horrible things in this war. This was worse than all of them combined, not because of the scale, but because of the intention. A battle kills people. This was something else. Something else. Not a battle. Not a military act. Something conducted with administrative records and neat handwriting and cause of death columns filled out by men who knew what they were writing was false." Rudolph Stein was tried by American Military Commission at Dachau in July 1946 as part of the Buchenwald-related proceedings. The Ohrdruf documentation, Major Whitefield's forensic reports, Sergeant Meyer's field notes, the seized administrative records, and the testimony of surviving prisoners formed a central part of the evidentiary record. Stein was convicted of participation in the killing of prisoners at Ohrdruf. He was sentenced to death. The counterintuitive truth at the center of this entire case is this: the SS system had built its own prosecution. The meticulous administrative records that had been designed to conceal what happened at Ohrdruf became the evidentiary foundation that proved it. Every cause of death entry that said hunger, while the body said bullet, was not just a lie. It was a document, preserved by the system's own obsession with paperwork, that made the lie provable. The cover-up was the evidence. The record that was meant to erase the crime had instead recorded the gap between what was written and what was true. That gap was 37 bullet wounds in 41 examined bodies. The Ohrdruf documentation process, established by Patton's April 6th orders, became the operational template for American forces discovering camps throughout the remainder of the war. The specific methodology, forensic examination before burial, administrative record seizure, civilian mandatory site visits, was formalized in a directive issued by Schaeff on April 21, 1945, drawing directly from Third Army's Ohrdruf procedures. The directive was applied at Dachau, Mauthausen, Ebensee, and more than 200 additional sites discovered by American forces between April and May 1945. The statistical result of the documentation effort is precise. By the time the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg convened on November 20, 1945, American forces had preserved and catalogued over 2,400 individual camp administrative record sets, covering prisoner populations, death logs, and cause-of-death records. The forensic examination methodology developed at Ohrdruf, matching body evidence against administrative claims, was applied at 34 sites and produced evidentiary packages used in 89 separate prosecution proceedings at Dachau, Nuremberg, and subsequent military commission trials. The enemy testimony layer is provided by SS Obersturmbannführer Hans Hettig, a senior camp commander tried at Dachau in 1946, whose defense explicitly argued that administrative records should be accepted as accurate cause-of-death documentation. The prosecution's rebuttal, based on the forensic methodology established at Ohrdruf, demonstrated systematically that the administrative records across multiple sites understated violent deaths by an estimated factor of 6 to 1. Hittig was convicted. Sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted, but the evidentiary methodology that dismantled his defense had originated in a conversation beside a pit in Ohrdruf on April 6, 1945, when a general read a medical report to a guard and asked him to explain the bullet holes. The guard had no answer. He had never expected anyone to count them. Dwight Eisenhower's April 15th letter to General Marshall, in which he described Ohrdruf and requested that witnesses be brought immediately to document what was there, contains a sentence that has been quoted in historical literature for 8 decades. He wrote that he wanted the evidence witnessed and recorded in order to have first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. He wrote that on April 15, 1945. The war in Europe had not yet ended. He was already preparing for the denial that he knew would come. Patton's contribution to that preparation was operational and specific. He had given orders on April 6th that transformed a crime scene into an evidentiary record. He had stood beside a man who had processed 70 deaths as hunger and shown him 37 bullet wounds. He had required the civilian population to see what the administrative records had hidden. He did not make speeches about it. His diary entry for April 6th, the day he confronted Stein at the pit, is 11 words long, Ohrdruf. The records lie. The bodies do not. Orders given. The universal principle those 11 words contain does not belong to military history. It belongs to every institution, every organization, every system that produces paperwork. Documents record what the writer chose to write. Evidence records what actually happened. When the two conflict, follow the evidence. The bullet holes do not lie.